I think all of you know I'm Liz Schneider and director of the program, and I am really happy to see all of you, and I'm really happy to have this wonderful program today, which could not be more timely. The major event that we have in the spring semester is on April 15th. It is the Sparrow 30th anniversary program. That's a Friday. There'll be a program in the afternoon in which we'll be bringing Sparrow alums together and have a big party in File Hall afterwards for faculty and alums from all over the country. I've already been in touch with many of them who are really excited to be coming, and it'll be a great opportunity, obviously, for all of you fellows to meet and get to know some of the incredible people who have been part of the history of the program. Kyle is going to talk about the Sparrow Leadership Group for a minute and then get us started.
I'm excited to welcome you all to today's panel discussion, which will continue the conversation that was started at the BLS Town Hall meeting on the migration crisis, with a specific focus on the Syrian community here in the United States. With us today, we have Lauren Kosev. Lauren is a 2006 BLS alum and Sparrow, and she works in the, sorry, I can't see with my glasses on. Lauren Kosev handles a wide range of immigration matters with a focus on complex deportation and removal defense. Ms. Kosev works extensively with the Syrian community, specifically on Syrian asylum claims. She will speak to us on the challenges of working with Syrian immigrants here in the United States. And she is joined by Professor Kaplow and Professor Fullerton. Professor Kaplow is the Assistant Dean to Brooklyn Law School's clinical program and the co-director of the Safe Harbor Project. Professor Kaplow is the leader in the immigration community and an expert on refugee and asylum law. Professor Fullerton is also an expert on refugee and asylum law. Her work focuses on the worldwide effect of the common European asylum system. We are lucky to be joined by such a wealth of knowledge today, and so without further ado, I would like to welcome our presenters. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Kyla, and to Katie Crisona also for helping to organize today's luncheon. And thanks so much to all of you for being here. As Kyla mentioned, we had a robust conversation about a month ago in the student lounge in the town meeting format, where mostly we talked about the European movement, mass movement of people, and what is, of course, being called a crisis, and in particular about the European response. So our follow-up, as Kyla pointed out, is really to focus now on U.S. law, the U.S. Capacity to respond to this crisis, what is happening, what should be happening, and we're lucky enough to have Lauren's perspective because she's been working with Syrian migrants for many, many years. So we'll be focusing on the U.S. legal regimes. But before getting to that, I had dinner with somebody the other night, an experienced lawyer who doesn't do anything with immigration law, who said, what's the difference between an asylee and a refugee? And while there are probably a lot of people in the room who could answer that question, I think the fact that that question is still, that those two terms are unclear and that they're kind of mixed up and fused, it's worth kind of getting the roadmap a little clearer before we start. So basically, people can be, as you know, people are forced out of their homes and then their homelands for a whole range of reasons, whether it's war, whether it's famine, other natural disaster, or various forms of persecution. The number of people who would basically be called forcibly displaced in the world is almost 60 million today. Not every one of those people is a refugee or an asylum seeker. They may be refugees with a small r in our more conventional understanding of the term. In other words, you're leaving your homeland you don't want to be, and you want somebody else to protect you, another country to protect you. But while there are 59.5 million people who are displaced, according to UNHCR, which is the UN refugee organization, not all of them are actually seeking asylum. Of those people, 41 million people from Syria are displaced outside of Syria now. So those, as I'm sure people know, are... Pardon me?
4.1, not 41.
What did I say?
41 million.
I'm sorry, 4.1, thank you, are outside. 41 would be the whole country. So 4.1 million, sorry, watch my decimal points, are displaced, and they're seeking refuge in neighboring countries. I mean, we know that there are camps and people in Turkey and in Lebanon. And then, of course, the wave of movement went beyond that and into Europe. But there are also 7.6 million people, I think I got the decimal right this time, who are internally displaced. They're still in Syria, but they're not at home. Their homes were bombed, and there's nowhere for them to live safely, but they're moving through the country. So there are people who are considered to be displaced who are both inside their own countries as well as outside their own countries. Now, to be a refugee, obviously, and again, I'm probably saying this to a lot of people who already know, that there's a convention, the convention relating to the status of refugees, to which most countries in the world, but not all, are signatories, and many countries have their own domestic refugee statutes and processing systems. The US has the Refugee Act of 1980, other countries, EU, other countries around the world have their own versions of that. But to be a refugee, sort of with a capital R, under the convention, you have to meet certain standards, and I'll just say them quickly so that anybody who doesn't know can get those landscape. It basically is any person who is unable or unwilling to return to, or unable or unwilling to avail him or herself of the protection of their country because of persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. So a lot of people talk about political asylum, but clearly it's available to more categories of people who are just being persecuted on account of a political opinion. So somebody who is a refugee can be designated a refugee and protected, but are not necessarily going to get asylum. Asylum is more of a form of permanent resettlement that in most cases allows somebody who gets asylum to enter sort of a pathway of regular status in whatever country they're in. So here, as we know in the US, you can eventually even naturalize. So we're just sort of talking about this to give you this little bit of a framework. The US has basically two streams by which people become recognized as refugees. One is overseas processing, where it's taking place outside of the US, either in a third country or even in the person's own country. Or if somebody actually gets to the US, they can seek asylum here. So Professor Fullerton's going to talk first about overseas refugee processing. We'll ping pong back to me briefly about what goes on in the US, and then Lauren will talk about sort of her on the ground and up in the air perspective.
Thank you. Thank you. So I would like to touch on 4 points in my introduction here. I'd like to give you a little bit of historical context about refugee processing. I'd like to tell you about the current legal framework. I'd like to discuss a tiny bit about how it works in practice, and I'd like to end with a comparison about how Syrians are being treated here and in other countries right now. So let me start with the history. And I guess I could go back to before the country was founded, but let me just start with World War II, where I think we all are well aware of the shameful response of the United States and many other countries in the world in not accepting Jewish refugees in the 1930s when they were being allowed to leave Germany, and not in the 1940s when some of them managed to leave. In the post-World War II era, the United States did much better under President Truman. We accepted 400,000 people as displaced persons in the early, or I guess I should say the late 1940s. And then things kept happening. In 1956, roughly 200,000 Hungarians walked across the border after their failed revolution into Austria. 30,000 of them were accepted in the United States. And then Castro came to power, and there were thousands of Cubans who came to the United States. By 1973, there were 700,000 Cubans living in the United States post-Castro. And then there was the Vietnam War, and there were 100,000 Vietnamese refugees who were admitted in the United States in 1975, and the numbers kept growing. All of this was done under a framework that didn't have a refugee law, and in each instance, essentially the administration, and it was both Republican and Democratic administrations, essentially took ad hoc measures using what's called the parole provision to allow refugees into the United States and to permanently resettle here. By 1980, there were, for a number of reasons, there was a decision to actually have a U.S. refugee law. And the law that came into effect in 1980 had the idea of most refugees coming to the United States would come through processing overseas. There was actually very little attention to asylum, including no procedure set out in the statute for people who got to the United States on their own. And then, just as that law passed, there was the Mariel crisis, in which 120,000 Cubans left Cuba in 6 months for the United States, which President Carter decided not to use the new law for, but essentially just to, in an ad hoc way, allow them to enter. So I tell you that because I want you to kind of get the sense that the United States has received and has had different responses to many, many different refugee flows, including many large numbers of refugees. And the 1980 Act was an effort by Congress, essentially, to try to have some role in what refugee resettlement would be like in the United States, not to have it an ad hoc executive decisions. So the current process under the 1980 legislation is that the president will negotiate, communicate with congressional leaders, and set goals for each year of how many refugees will be admitted to the United States from refugee camps abroad, essentially. And there are both overall goals and regional goals. And if you have one of these handouts on your table, you'll see that the overall goals, this is the top graph, have varied dramatically from the beginning in terms of the numbers. In the early 1980s, it was the United States set a goal, Congress and the United States working together, to accept more than 200,000 refugees each fiscal year. And then the numbers went down, as you can see, and then in 1993 they went up again. That was in response to the Balkan crisis, the Balkan wars, Bosnia in particular. And you can see that towards the end, the United States has kind of moved into this negotiation where roughly 70,000 refugees are set as the goal for each year. And the United States has pretty much lived up to that. In other words, the goals are not perfectly met, but if there's 70,000 that are aimed for, close to 70,000 usually come. What that means in terms of usually come is that the people who are selected as refugees through a process I'll describe in a minute overseas will come with assistance from, for their airfare. They will come knowing that they will have support once they're in the United States. There's a lot of partnerships between social service agencies and other NGOs and the U.S. government to make sure every refugee who comes through this program will have a place to live, will have help getting a job, will have language training available, will have other vocational training available. It's certainly not perfect. The amount of cash assistance, in my view, is shockingly low, but it is a supported route to try to include people from abroad who have met the refugee definition that Stacy just defined, and to make sure they have a a good start in the United States. So one of the big distinctions here is overseas refugee processing means that those refugees come having already been cleared as having met the refugee definition, and they come with government and social service promises of support to help them get started in the United States. If you look at the second visual on this page, you'll see that there are not only overall targets or ceilings, but that within each year's target for overseas refugee resettlement, there is a breakdown by region. And within these regions, you can imagine that the Syrians will fall within the Near East region. So that's the area that we're looking at. The United States, as I said, has mostly had a target of roughly 70,000 refugees for the past few years. For the current year, which started October 1st, for the 2016 fiscal year, that number has moved up to 85,000, and the Obama administration has said it'll move up to 100,000 for the 2017 fiscal year. So there is a slow ramping up year by year in terms of the overall numbers of refugees that can be resettled, or that the United States says they will resettle. Interestingly to me, and very surprising, the admissions for 2016, although they are 85,000 rather than 70,000, have only 1,000 more allotted to the Near East. So Near East is 34,000 under the new admission ceilings, and Africa is up to 25,000. Now, I'll explain in a moment why that is, but it just gives you a sense that there are a lot of moving parts, and mostly that there's a lag in the processing. And there, of course, are many more refugees, 15 million probably people in the world who meet the refugee definition, of whom we're taking 70,000, maybe 85,000, maybe 100,000. Just out of, I guess, my curiosity, I was very interested to look at who the largest groups were who were resettled over the past 3 years in the United States through this process. And the largest group is Iraqis, roughly 20,000 a year, although it varies. And then the second largest group has been Burmese, or people from Myanmar, roughly 15,000 a year. And then, to my surprise, Bhutan was another country that had a lot of, was the third or fourth highest in the last few years, and then a lot of Somalis, talking maybe 8,000 people a year. Syria is nowhere in the framework of recent refugee resettlement. So how does it happen? Overseas, there are 9 refugee support centers that the U.S. runs in cooperation with NGOs. And essentially, those support centers gather information about refugees who have applied to be resettled in other countries, U.S., Canada, Australia being the countries that most frequently resettle refugees. Typically what happens is the UNHCR will recommend cases to those refugee support centers, and sometimes the U.S. Embassy will, sometimes other groups will, and those refugee support centers, which are run by entities like the International Rescue Committee, so very, not only reputable, but people with lots of expertise in dealing with refugees, collect biographical data on each person who's been recommended for resettlement. Then the next step is that the U.S. Department of Homeland Security essentially sends asylum officers overseas who review the files at these refugee support centers, have in-person interviews with the people who have been recommended for resettlement in the United States, apply the refugee definition, and also look for any exclusions or things that would make a person inadmissible, such as have they given any material support to a terrorist or to an organization that might be deemed terrorist, and I think we'll hear more about this later. So there's an in-person interview. If you pass the in-person interview, then there's a health screening, so that things like tuberculosis and other communicable diseases are set up. And then there are security checks. The DHS does its security checks. FBI does security checks. The CIA does security checks. All national intelligence agencies do checks on people who have been adjudicated, so to speak, by the U.S. asylum officers as worthy of resettlement in the United States. And of the roughly 800,000 refugees who've been resettled in the United States since 9/11, there have been 3 that have been arrested for being involved in planning terrorist attacks. So that's one issue you often hear about. How does the screening protect the country? And 2 of those 3 were accused of being involved in attacks with targets outside the United States. The long and the short of it is that it's long. These screenings take 18 to 24 months. And so even if the United States commits to taking 50,000 Syrian refugees this year in terms of refugee resettlement from abroad, it's going to take at least 18 months to get them through the whole process. That's no reason not to start, in my view, but it is a reason to understand why there are these time lags. In terms of Syrians, on the other side of this sheet, and how generous the United States is. First, talking about how generous the United States is. The United States has by far the biggest refugee resettlement program of any country in the world, and the United States does it every year consistently. However, we're also the biggest and the wealthiest, and so if you look at that graph, you can see that other countries, let's say Australia, take far fewer than the United States every year, but in terms of proportion of their population, they in fact are doing more. So it's just a reminder to us, with, at least for me, sometimes the hubris of being such a big country, taking so many refugees, that there are other ways to measure how generous countries are in receiving refugees. In terms of the specific numbers, UNHCR has recommended 130,000 Syrians to be resettled by the end of 2016. So, and that number may change, but that's what the UNHCR has recommended now. It has drawn together countries from around the world, and the countries, including the US, collectively have pledged to take about 100,000 of those. So there's still some that the UNHCR has said are desperately in need, are very vulnerable of resettlement that no country has pledged to take. So there's a gap there. The Canadians, nice comparison for us, have pledged to take 25,000 Syrians by December 31st of this year. And they are desperately trying to get it done. Their process usually takes about 4 months of screening rather than 18 to 24 months. But they've got also domestic concerns about terrorism, and they, of course, have a much smaller population. So at least in comparison to the Canadians in terms of resettlement, the United States could do more. We're being shown up by our northern neighbors. The U.S. pledged to take 1,000 to 2,000 Syrian refugees in fiscal year 2015. The actual number is 1,293. But that's within the range, 1,000 to 2,000. The U.S. has pledged to take 10,000 Syrian refugees in 2016 and to take more in 2017. The last thing I want to comment on is that the International Rescue Committee has argued that the United States should accept from overseas refugee resettlement programs 65,000 refugees from Syria. where that number comes from is it's 50% of the UNHCR recommended number of 130,000. And the United States, as I said, typically has been one of the biggest refugee resettlement programs in the world. Senator Durbin and 13 other Democratic senators have written a letter to the Obama administration essentially supporting that view that the United States should accept 65,000 refugees from Syria, saying we should do at least 50% of the numbers that have already been identified. As you can see, so far that suggestion has not been taken. Last point I want to make, and it's this bar graph in the bottom here. The bar graph is a little bit of a misnomer because it talks about resettlement of Syrian refugees, and it has Germany up top. Now, Germany has, in fact, taken 30,000 refugees, but they don't have a refugee resettlement program. So this is kind of confusing, giving asylum to asylees with overseas refugee processing. But it reminds us that overseas refugee processing is only one part of providing protection to people who are in need of it. And even when we look at that, the United States could, in my view, do better. And that's where I'll leave my comments for now.
Okay, I'm going to just briefly speak about sort of an overview of the U.S. system, but also just to let you know that there's another handout on the table, which is the map of the U.S., and it just shows you where the people from Syria who've already been resettled have gone, and you can see that a lot of them seem to go to Houston, but as the government sort of says, they resettle people where there are already communities that can support them, so it's sort of a self-perpetuating demographic. So the U.S. is clearly, as Professor Fullerton says, the topmost resettlement country in the world. And according to the Department of State, we resettle here 67% of all refugees. So that's a lot. Canada, for all their generosity, up till now has resettled 9.9% of the world's refugees. So, the gap, even though as we can be critical of, of an inadequacy of our response or slowness of it, it's, I think the U.S. is pretty generous in terms of its resettlement efforts and also in terms of asylum. So the main difference between what we've been what Professor Fullerton talked about in asylum is really where the decision-making takes place, where the determination that somebody is a refugee is made, whether it's abroad or in the U.S., and a little bit about the process, although a lot of the same agencies are involved, all the same screenings take place and all of that, and obviously the same basic law applies with respect to what a definition of a refugee is, as well as the various things that can preclude you or bar you from being granted asylum. So just to put things into perspective a little bit, about 25,199, this sort of sounds like when you go to the store and they say 99 cents, 25,199 people were granted asylum in fiscal year 2013, which unfortunately is the last year for which there are collected statistics. 61% of those people were affirmatively put themselves into asylum proceedings. They asked for asylum. They filed an application. 39% of them raised an asylum claim when they were already in removal proceedings. So, more people, of course, come to this country either with the idea of applying for asylum or develop that idea shortly after they're here. Now, as we've already commented, Syrians are kind of like a blip on this screen right now. The highest number of asylum seekers in the United States are from China, and they're by a lot. And then Egyptians and Ethiopians are second and third, and they, in combination, those three nationalities account for 52% of all asylum applications. And then everything else is spread out among lots of other countries. And as you can imagine, it really sort of depends on what's going on in these countries. Certain groups will rise and fall on the numbers depending on what the conditions are like. In 2013, Syria, it was in 5th place. All of a sudden, it's the first time it showed up on the as being having a significant number. But the number of asylees from Syria in that year, in 2013, were 811. That compares to 8,604 from China. So it's still a very small percentage of the population. Of course, 2013 predates most of what is going on now, although obviously there were some problems even as far back as then. So between fiscal year 2012 and fiscal year 2014, the number of Syrian applications that were filed were 4,109. So most of them were filed affirmatively. People asked for asylum status. And the affirmative grant rates were at least 61%. But overall, the grant rate for Syrian asylum seekers is 81%. So most Syrians who apply for asylum are getting it. Some might not be getting it because of other impediments. For example, you have to apply within a year of your arrival, so they may not get asylum, they may get some other form of relief, but basically it's a pretty high grant rate. Asylum, once you're here in the US and you're physically present, the principal asylum seeker can include their minor children and spouse. Sometimes those minor children and spouse are here already, they can all come together. Sometimes they're somewhere else, whether it's back in Syria or whether it's in another country. And once you get asylum, though, it carries the important benefit of being able to include those immediate relatives in the relief that you're getting. So if they're out of the country, they come to this country as asylees, having been derivatively granted asylum because of the grant in the US. Asylum also carries with it the opportunity to work with authorization, with refugee resettlement benefits, but not quite as generous because there isn't anything taking place before people get here. It's really all, and some people don't even sign up for it, but you get certain benefits. You can travel, nice little refugee travel document that people can get, and most importantly, you can apply for permanent residence after a year, as can people who come as refugees from overseas. And so can your family members, et cetera. And that, of course, leads to citizenship eventually. So in effect, asylum can be a form of permanent relief. Just briefly, I want to mention the other response that the U.S. has had to the Syrian crisis, as well as other crises, is in another form of humanitarian relief called temporary protected status. This is basically saying, if you're here in the U.S. and something really horrible is happening in your country, you don't have to go back and face that. We'll let you stay here temporarily until whatever the problem is goes away. Now, sometimes it's, for example, the Nepalese earthquake or the Haitian earthquake. My favorite example was when the little Caribbean island of Montserrat, which is pretty much one giant volcano, erupted. So if you were from Montserrat and you were here in the US, you could stay, you didn't have to go back. But other places, such as Somalia, various Central American countries, Sudan, they are long-time temporary protected status countries. Some in Liberia, there are people who've been here for 20 plus years, having received over and over again temporary protected status because conditions in their country hadn't improved. Liberia was a temporary protected country while the Ebola crisis was going on. In any case, in 2012, the U.S. designated Syria as meriting temporary, Syrians here in the United States as meriting temporary protected status. In 2015, in January, it was extended for another 18 months. Now, it doesn't get you any long-term protection, but it means that you can stay here in the U.S., you can work. You can't bring relatives in necessarily, but there's this re-registration process so that if somebody comes later and they're here at the time when it's designated again, then you're eligible to apply. In 2015, in January, when the redesignation came about, there was an estimate of about another 5,000 Syrians would apply. Apparently that has not really happened. The numbers just haven't really been met. Lauren's going to talk about that more. One reason might be that more Syrians are actually applying for asylum. But in any case, the TPS status is another response that the United States has made to the Syrian crisis. Yemen was also just recently put into TPS status, so you can get a sense of what kinds of situations out there in the world merit this. Now, when I Googled Syrians and TPS, because of course, how else do people do their research, what showed up but the law firm of Al-Jajaqli and Kosef as the third, after the USCIS.gov website, there they were. So here we have one of the experts about the Syrian refugee crisis right in front of us, third place in Google.
Well, I'd
Go
like
for
to
it.
try to beat out USCIS. That'll have to be our goal for the next year to get that top ranking there. Well, first I'd like to thank you for having me. It feels great to be back here at Brooklyn Law School. I have to start by saying that I got my inspiration to work in immigration law from these two women here and also Dan Smullian. So I'm happy to try to give something back by coming here today and talking about my work with Syrians. My partner, Nadine Al-Jajaqli, is Syrian American, and she's always been very active in the Syrian American community. So we do diverse immigration cases. We do a lot of marriage-based cases where people are getting green cards through marriage, but since the war in Syria started, we have been pretty much focused on assisting Syrians, both in paid cases and in doing a lot of pro bono work. As Professors Kaplow and Fullerton have talked about, the news has been saturated with reports about the Syrian refugees, and I imagine that everyone knows a lot about that even coming into this lunch today. What I'd like to talk about today is the work that Nadine and I have done in trying to assist Syrians in coming to the United States through means other than as refugees, and also the applications we filed on behalf of Syrians who are fortunate to already be here in the United States. This work, and it's been pretty early in my career for me, but I think it has been the most exhilarating and also the most maddening that I may experience. On a positive note, I feel like we've gotten to represent some people who are really heroes among us. These are the kind of asylum cases that I always dreamed I would work on when I was sitting in a small windowless room in the Safe Harbor Clinic. One of the first cases we prepared was for a young doctor who had established underground medical clinics to treat protesters and innocent civilians who had been wounded when the regime responded with lethal violence to the peaceful protest, to the Syrian people's request for very minor human rights protections. So our client helped to set up these clinics, which were really important because the regime was going into the hospitals and taking wounded people out of the hospitals and torturing and killing them. So they needed another place where they could seek life-saving medical treatment. He also provided pretty much around-the-clock Skype support to the people who were working in these clinics, because a lot of them weren't trained medical professionals. They didn't have the degree of sophistication to provide life-saving medical care. And so he was on Skype advising people how to save people's lives. So this client was granted asylum. So his story has a very happy ending, and it was a really strong start to our work with Syrians here in the United States. Since that time, I feel like our work with Syrians, both abroad and those who are here in the United States, has been really kind of frustrating. There seems to be a real disconnect between the intent of the asylum and refugee systems and the way it's playing out on the ground. We've heard about how the refugee system isn't working. We have, as has been mentioned already, over 4 million Syrian refugees outside of the country, over 8 million within the country who desperately need safe resettlement. But the refugee processing system is too confusing. I mean, the people who contact us don't even understand what needs to be done or what steps they need to take, and then they're operating from within a war-stricken country. And then it's also, as Professor Fullerton said, too slow. And ultimately, only about 1% of the refugees will be referred for resettlement in a safe third country. So, given that inadequacy, which is probably putting it lightly, the other option for Syrians is to try to get somewhere on their own. And particularly at the beginning of the crisis in Syria, and especially for Nadine, because she speaks Arabic, we were receiving like hundreds of calls a day from Syrians who were desperate to get out of Syria. So these were people who were calling from their basements while the regime was bombing their houses, people that the secret police were looking for, which is never, ever a good thing in Syria. families with young children and elderly people needing medical care. And they were calling to say, so how can we get to the United States? The United States is the country that helps people like us. And unfortunately, there wasn't often much that we could do for these people. Some fortunate Syrians already had visitors visas, and so they were able to come here on visitors visas. You can't just come here to apply for asylum, so you have to find some other way to gain admission, and then once you're here, change your mind and decide to apply for asylum. So some people were fortunate and they had the visitor visas and they could come, but for a lot of other people who didn't have them, they've been very, very elusive. There is not a US embassy in Syria, so they couldn't go to the US embassy there to apply. But even for Syrians who made their way to Turkey or Lebanon or other neighboring countries, we find that many, many of these applications are being denied. It's really hard for Syrians to prove that they're just coming as visitors, meaning that they plan to go back, because the United States is naturally suspicious. Who really wants to go back to Syria right now? I mean, I wouldn't choose to go back to Syria. But I have consulted with some people who had every intention of going back, either to Syria or to a neighboring country where they are trying to buy time and during the pendency of the war in Syria. And those applications have unfortunately been denied as well. I mean, I feel like what I can provide here is some really anecdotal evidence of what it's like for these real people. So I thought I would tell you quickly about two visitor visa applications that really struck me as concerning or disturbing. We have a client who is here. She's applied for asylum in TPS. She's a young woman, and her father and her uncle were both repeatedly detained and tortured because of their activism against the regime. She was sexually assaulted because of her father and her uncle's opposition work. And she made it to the United States, which was, obviously fortunate for her. And she and her husband were expecting their first child. It was a very difficult pregnancy, and she felt very vulnerable and insecure here in this new country. So her mother went to the US Embassy in Lebanon, where she's living, and applied for a visitor visa twice, asking that she be allowed to come here to be with her daughter at the time of her scheduled C-section. And she brought just piles of evidence that she planned to return. She had other children living in Lebanon. This woman really intended to just come and visit for the birth of this child and go back. But she was denied both times, and it just seemed that the United States government thought it was more concerning that this grandmother would come and overstay than that this family be allowed to be together at this time. And then the other case, which I bring up particularly because today is Veterans Day, involves a Syrian man who is naturalized as a US citizen, and his sister applied recently to come and visit because their mother has just had her third open heart surgery. Her application was also denied, despite the fact that her brother wrote a letter on her behalf, as did his commander in the US Air Force, because he served in the US Air Force, and he continues to be a member of the Ready Reserves and has a Medal of Honor. So I thought perhaps the United States Embassy could have taken into consideration that he's likely to be credible. He's done this honorable service for our country, and let his sister visit, but she was denied as well. So it's really hard to get a visitor visa for Syrians right now. As Professor Kaplan mentioned, in the 4.5 years of war in Syria, only about 4,000 Syrians have applied for asylum. So there's really a desperate need, but there's just no way to get them here. And what I've seen in our work is that the Syrians who can get here seem to be, this is, this shouldn't be a generalization, but a lot of the Syrians who come here are those with a lot of financial resources. We hear from a lot of people who, already had visitor visas because they were already traveling to the United States or internationally. We are in contact with a lot of Syrians who were already living in other countries, generally in the Middle East, often in the wealthy Gulf states. Those countries are problematic because they don't offer permanent resettlement to these people very often, so it's always kind of a tenuous situation. Like, maybe I can stay here, but maybe someday Saudi Arabia is going to tell me I have to leave, and then I could get sent back to Syria. But they are people who had perhaps some other options. And it's been wonderful to represent all kinds of Syrians, but what we've always hoped is that a wider scope of the population could make its way here. And again, as Professor Kaplow touched upon, asylum is intended to protect people who have been persecuted or who face persecution. Anyone who has any experience in immigration law knows that a lot of people apply for asylum because it's kind of a last-ditch application. There's no other means of relief or means of staying here available, and perhaps they would be forced to return to countries that are, have a lot of poverty or unrest or, just a generally low quality of living. And I've always been very sympathetic to these cases. I've worked on lots of them myself, and I understand that people just want to live in the best place they possibly can and have a safe and healthy place to raise their families. But I also acknowledge that sometimes these cases are a real stretch. And now here we have all of these Syrians who are very genuine asylum seekers. These are people who are being persecuted by their government. We have photographs documenting the fact that they are slaughtering and torturing their citizens. I mean, we talk to people about this all the time. I mean, I don't even want to know about the things that people in Syria are doing to other people. I really didn't anticipate this in going into this line of work, but now I know. And it really makes me think these are people who should get asylum. So, that I think is the most salient message that I can bring here today from my work, is that it's really hard to tell Syrians that the United States, which we've established is the worldwide leader in refugee resettlement, isn't reaching out to do more to help them. Also, the issue of material support came up earlier, and the law says that anyone who has participated in a terrorist group or materially supported a terrorist group is barred from getting asylum or other immigration benefits here in the United States. And this seems like a necessary law and reasonable on its face. We don't want terrorists coming here. Yes, of course. But the problem that we've seen with Syrians is really the expansive manner in which it's been applied. We have a client who is an activist. She organized women to attend protests where they chanted for reform. Nothing more, just please, stop torturing the innocent Syrian people. She collected supplies for families who had lost members to regime-perpetrated violence, families where perhaps the father had been killed at a protest or killed because of activism and they needed support. And she provided some first aid to wounded protesters. So she came here and she applied for asylum and temporary protected status. And then she received an inquiry in connection with her TPS application, which said, on your asylum application, you said you were politically active. Based on that, it appears that you and your husband were members of a terrorist organization. And this is only very lightly paraphrased. So this is the connection immigration made. You are politically active, you sound like a terrorist. And this inquiry left the client and me incredulous. I mean, politically active and terrorist, they're not synonymous, and her activism, again, consisted of chanting for reform to protect school children from being tortured and collecting diapers and formula for needy babies. The United States is supposed to be protecting her. I mean, she was targeted by the regime because of her activism, and she fled here for her life. And instead, she came here and they said, you sound like the problem. So, when I interact with this woman, and she's this very thoughtful, sensitive person, I mean, she's just dumbfounded that this is the way her case has played out. And it's very hard to explain this to her. And now she has the burden of proving that she's not a terrorist. And of course she's not, but this is difficult to prove. And fortunately for her, she was active in the revolution very early on, before there were armed opposition groups. At the time she was active in the revolution, the only party committing violence was the regime. So it's easier for her to establish that she wasn't in cahoots with the Free Syria Army because it wasn't established then and it wasn't engaged in acts that have been deemed to be terrorist acts by the United States. But it's still a difficult burden. I mean, she has to prove that the people she provided first aid to were not, even unbeknownst to her, members of a terrorist group. So this has been very, very challenging. And because of this inquiry, both her asylum and her TPS cases have been delayed even more than they might normally be. And her case is uniquely challenging, but for all of our clients, the delays have been really challenging. There's a 2 to 3 year backlog in the asylum office. And so for some clients, they're happy to be here. And then for some clients, it's really very, very trying because every day they're haunted by the idea, like, maybe I'm gonna have to go back to Syria. Like, I have a really good case, but you never know what could happen. And maybe I'm gonna go back there and really, it sounds melodramatic, but going back to Syria really is a death sentence for a lot of these people. I think we're running out of time. Okay, so we need more staff, both abroad and here. We really need to expedite these interviews because then we go on the interviews and they say, you've been here for so long, don't you think you could go back safely now? And we think, well, this is really outlandish to turn it on its head like that. Like, you kept me waiting here all this time, now you think maybe I should give it a try and go back to Syria? So that's also troublesome. Anyway, but we do have lots of clients who apply for TPS, very, very valuable. I think it's much easier to get, it's an easier application, it's processed much more efficiently, so that's great. Some people apply for both asylum and TPS in conjunction. It gives them the TPS, the certainty of that, while the asylum is pending. Some people just apply for TPS. Something we were talking about before this is some Syrians would really like to go back to Syria ultimately. Like, they're not just opportunity seeking, like, maybe I could get to stay in the United States. This is maybe a goal to go back to Syria. Anyway, and there's just so much more that we could be doing. We can talk about that maybe another time, but I wish there were more we could do for our clients because we get to know them on this very human level, and we know that they're just reasonable people who want a safe place to live. They're not terrorists. They're just people like we are. So, it's good when it works out, but it's also really challenging because there's so many obstacles in our way.
I'm going to suggest before people clap and make noise, and everybody who has to leave should leave, but certainly Lauren, I'm sure will stay, and if people have particular questions or just gather around or whatever, but the formal part of the program can end. And now you can clap.